Officer Mark Gray had always believed that his badge was more than just a piece of metal pinned to his chest. To him, it was a symbol of power, respect, and control. For 10 years, he patrolled the streets of his small town with an unwavering sense of authority. He prided himself on being someone who kept things in order. But what Mark didn't realize was that his confidence often crossed into arrogance. Over time, he began to see himself not as a public servant, but as someone above the rules. A man whose uniform gave him permission to bend them. Mark's day usually started the same way: coffee at the station, a quick briefing, and then hours spent cruising through quiet neighborhoods or along empty highways. His favorite part of the job: traffic stops. It wasn't because he cared about safety. It was because he loved the moment when drivers realized they were caught. That split second of panic, followed by their fumbling for documents or stammering excuses, made him feel invincible. On this particular evening, Mark sat in his patrol car under the dim glow of a street lamp, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. The air outside was cool, and the roads were unusually quiet. Most people were already home, settling into their routines, watching TV, cooking dinner, or tucking their kids into bed. But Mark wasn't ready to call it a night. He scanned the road ahead, his eyes sharp and alert, searching for anything out of place. And then he saw it. A sleek black sedan sped past him, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beams of determination. Mark squinted at the speedometer on his dashboard. The car was going 5 miles over the limit, not enough to cause alarm, but enough for him to justify pulling it over. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips as he flicked on his flashing lights. This was his domain, and tonight he was king. As the sedan slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder, Mark grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car. The night was still, save for the faint hum of crickets in the distance. He approached the driver's side cautiously, shining his light into the vehicle. Behind the wheel sat a woman, mid-30s, elegant, and surprisingly calm given the situation. Her hands rested gently on the steering wheel, and there was no trace of nervousness in her expression. If anything, she looked almost amused. Mark cleared his throat and adjusted his tone to sound firm. "License and registration, please," he said, tapping his flashlight against his palm for emphasis. The woman nodded politely and reached into her glove compartment without hesitation. Something about her demeanor unsettled him. Most people would be flustered or apologetic during a traffic stop, but not her. She exuded a quiet confidence that made him question whether she truly understood the gravity of the moment, or if she simply didn't care. Little did Mark know this encounter would challenge everything he thought he knew about authority, consequences, and the limits of his power. The traffic stop began like any other, but there was an undercurrent of tension that Mark couldn't quite place. As he stood beside the sleek black sedan, his flashlight casting a pale glow into the car, he studied the woman behind the wheel. She wasn't what he expected. Most drivers in this situation would be fumbling nervously, their voices trembling as they tried to explain themselves. But not her. Elena Carter radiated calmness, almost as if she had been waiting for him. "License and registration, please," Mark repeated, his tone firm but tinged with irritation. He tapped his flashlight against his leg, a habit he'd developed over years of policing to assert his authority. Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she gave him a polite smile, reached into her purse, and handed over her documents without hesitation. There was no groveling, no hurried apologies, just quiet compliance. Mark took the papers and stepped back toward his patrol car, glancing at them under the light. Her name was printed neatly on the license, Elena Carter. The address listed was unfamiliar to him. It belonged to one of the wealthier neighborhoods outside of town. That alone raised questions in his mind. What was someone like her doing in this part of town so late at night? And why did she seem so unfazed by his presence? As he ran her information through the system, Mark's unease grew. The database confirmed her identity, but it also revealed something unexpected. Elena wasn't just another driver. She was a prominent civil rights attorney known for taking on high-profile cases involving police misconduct. Her name had appeared in local news articles and legal journals more times than Mark cared to count. Suddenly, the routine traffic stop felt less like a mundane duty and more like stepping onto shaky ground. By the time he returned to the sedan, Mark's confidence had wavered slightly, though he tried hard not to show it. He cleared his throat and leaned down to speak through the open window. "Do you know why I pulled you over, ma'am?" he asked, injecting a note of authority back into his voice. Elena tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I assume it's because I was driving 5 miles over the speed limit," she replied coolly. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but there was an edge to it, a subtle challenge that made Mark bristle. "That's correct," he said, gripping his flashlight a little tighter. "Is there a reason you were speeding?" Her lips curved into a faint smile, one that seemed both amused and knowing. "Sometimes rules are meant to guide us, not bind us," she said cryptically. Then, after a pause, she added, "But I suppose that depends on who's enforcing them." Mark blinked, caught off guard by her response. It wasn't the typical excuse or apology he was used to hearing. Her words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment, he wondered if he should let her go with a warning, but pride, and perhaps a stubborn need to prove himself, stopped him. He reminded himself that he was the one in charge here. She might have connections and fancy credentials, but he wore the badge. "I'll need to issue you a ticket," he said finally, pulling out his citation book. His hand moved mechanically as he filled in the details, though his thoughts were racing. Who exactly was this woman, and why did she make him feel so uncertain? When he handed her the ticket, Elena accepted it gracefully, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, officer," she said softly. There was no sarcasm in her voice, yet her words carried weight. As she drove away, Mark watched the taillights disappear into the night, a strange mixture of frustration and unease settling in his chest. Something told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mark stood by his patrol car, the crumpled ticket still warm in his hand, staring at the empty stretch of road where Elena's sedan had vanished. His mind replayed her words over and over again. Sometimes rules are meant to guide us, not bind us. What did she mean by that? And why had she looked at him as if she knew something he didn't? The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. He glanced down at the license and registration papers she'd handed him. They were perfectly in order, no smudges or signs of tampering. Everything about her seemed calculated, deliberate, even the way she had spoken. It wasn't defiance. It was something else. Confidence? Authority? Whatever it was, it made him feel small, like a child trying to act tough in front of an adult who saw right through him. Curiosity gnawed at him. He decided to dig deeper. Back inside his patrol car, Mark pulled up the database on his laptop and entered Elena's name again. This time he went beyond the basic search. He scrolled through archived records, news articles, and legal documents tied to her name. What he found left him stunned. Elena Carter wasn't just any attorney. She was one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the region, known for taking on cases that challenged police misconduct and systemic injustice. Her work had earned her national recognition, including features in prominent newspapers and interviews on television programs. Mark stared at the screen, his jaw tightening as he read headlines like, "Local Attorney Fights for Accountability," and "Victims Find Justice Through Elena Carter's Tenacity." But what really caught his attention was a case from 2 years ago. Elena had represented a man who claimed he was wrongfully detained during a routine traffic stop. According to court records, the officer involved had allegedly used excessive force and fabricated evidence. The case ended with a hefty settlement against the department and disciplinary action for the officer. Mark felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Could this be why she seemed so composed? Did she see him as just another statistic waiting to happen? His thoughts spiraled further when he noticed something else. Elena frequently gave talks and seminars on police accountability. One article mentioned how she often encouraged citizens to document interactions with law enforcement using dash cams and smartphones. Was that why she hadn't argued or pleaded with him? Had she recorded their entire encounter? The idea sent a chill down his spine. If she had footage of the stop, what would it show? Would it portray him as professional and fair, or as someone abusing his power? Mark suddenly realized that his usual tactics, the stern tone, the unnecessary citations, the subtle intimidation, might not hold up under scrutiny. For the first time in his career, doubt crept into his mind. Was he enforcing the law, or was he flexing his ego? As he sat there, gripping the steering wheel tightly, Mark tried to shake off the unease building inside him. Maybe he was overthinking things. After all, issuing a ticket for speeding was hardly grounds for a lawsuit, but deep down he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he'd underestimated Elena. She wasn't some ordinary driver. She was smart, prepared, and unafraid to challenge authority. For now, the night was quiet, and the streets were empty. But Mark couldn't escape the sense that this moment, a seemingly routine traffic stop, had set something bigger into motion. Whether it would blow over or spiral out of control remained to be seen. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. Pulling over Elena Carter had been a mistake. A big one. Back at the station later that night, Mark tried to shake off the unease that had settled over him like a heavy fog. He replayed the traffic stop in his mind, dissecting every word Elena had said and every glance she'd given him. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself it was just another routine citation, something about her lingered, like an unanswered question nagging at the edges of his thoughts. The next morning didn't bring relief. In fact, things only got worse. As soon as Mark walked into the precinct, he noticed the unusual quiet. Normally, the room buzzed with chatter, officers swapping stories, radios crackling in the background, the hum of keyboards clicking as reports were filed. Today, though, there was an eerie stillness. Heads turned slightly when he entered, but no one greeted him. Instead, they exchanged quick glances before returning to their work. Mark's stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. He made his way to his desk, where a blinking message light on the office phone caught his eye. His sergeant wanted to see him immediately. The summons sent a jolt of dread through him. What could this be about? Traffic stops rarely warranted special attention unless something went terribly wrong. And yet, as he headed toward the sergeant's office, he couldn't help but think of Elena Carter and the cryptic warning in her voice. You have no idea what you're dealing with. When he stepped inside, Sergeant Hayes looked up from a stack of papers. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. Close the door, Hayes said, his tone clipped. Mark obeyed, his heart pounding as he took a seat across from his superior. Do you know why I called you in here? Hayes asked, leaning forward. When Mark shook his head, Hayes slid a folder across the desk. Inside were printed emails and screenshots of social media posts, all related to the traffic stop. One post featured a photo of the ticket Mark had issued to Elena, accompanied by a caption that read, "Another example of unnecessary policing." The comments section was flooded with outrage, accusations of harassment, and calls for accountability. This woman you pulled over last night, Hayes began, tapping the folder with his pen, isn't just some random driver. She's Elena Carter. You've heard of her? Mark swallowed hard. Yes, sir, he admitted reluctantly. I ran her info after the stop. I knew she was an attorney. Hayes raised an eyebrow. An attorney who specializes in police misconduct cases. Do you understand what that means? She doesn't back down easily. And now, she's filed a formal complaint against you. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. A formal complaint? Over a speeding ticket? It seemed absurd, but then again, nothing about this situation felt normal. What exactly is she accusing me of? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She claims you targeted her unnecessarily, that your behavior during the stop was aggressive and unprofessional, Hayes explained. And she has dashcam footage to back it up. Dashcam footage. Of course she did. Mark remembered her calm demeanor, the way she hadn't argued or pleaded, just handed over her documents and let him do his job. At the time, he'd thought she was simply cooperating. Now he realized she'd been gathering evidence. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying Mark carefully. Look, I'm not saying you're guilty of anything, but we need to take this seriously. Internal Affairs is already involved, and if her allegations gain traction, it could reflect poorly on the entire department. So tell me, Gray, what really happened out there? Mark hesitated. How could he explain what he barely understood himself? Yes, he'd pulled her over for speeding, but he also couldn't deny that part of him had enjoyed asserting his authority. He'd relied on his badge to intimidate people before, assuming it gave him the upper hand. But now, faced with someone who refused to be intimidated, he felt exposed, like a bully caught in the act. I followed protocol, he said finally, though even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. She was speeding and I issued a ticket, that's all. Hayes sighed, rubbing his temples. Protocol isn't going to save you if she decides to push this further. Be prepared for questions, Gray, lots of them. As Mark left the office, his mind raced. For years he'd believed his badge protected him, shielded him from consequences. Now, for the first time, he wondered if it had actually made him vulnerable. If Elena Carter wanted answers, she was going to get them. And Mark wasn't sure he was ready to face them. The days that followed felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. Mark tried to go about his duties as usual, but the weight of Elena's complaint loomed over him like a dark cloud. Every time his radio crackled or a colleague approached him, he braced himself for bad news. The once familiar hallways of the precinct now felt alien, filled with sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered the room. Internal Affairs wasted no time launching an investigation. They requested copies of his report from the traffic stop, reviewed footage from his patrol car's dash cam, and even interviewed witnesses, though finding anyone who had seen the incident proved nearly impossible. It was late at night on a deserted road. Mark and Elena were the only two people present. That left her version of events versus his, and Mark knew hers carried far more weight. To make matters worse, word spread quickly among the officers. Some avoided him altogether, while others offered half-hearted reassurances. "Don't worry, man," one colleague said, clapping him on the shoulder. "These things blow over." But Mark could see the doubt in their eyes. No one wanted to be associated with controversy, especially not when it involved someone as high-profile as Elena Carter. Meanwhile, Elena herself remained eerily silent. She didn't call Mark directly or demand a public apology. Instead, she let the process play out, allowing Internal Affairs to do its job. Yet her absence from the narrative only added to Mark's unease. What was she planning? Was she waiting for the perfect moment to strike? One evening, as Mark sat alone in his apartment nursing a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed with a notification. He opened it hesitantly, dreading what he might find. It was an email alert. A local news outlet had picked up the story. The headline read, "Prominent attorney challenges officer's conduct during routine traffic stop." Below it was a photo of Elena standing confidently outside a courthouse, her expression calm yet resolute. The article recounted the details of the stop, quoting Elena's statement about feeling targeted and intimidated. It also included snippets from her dashcam footage which showed Mark leaning into her window, his posture rigid, his tone sharp. Watching himself on screen made Mark cringe. He sounded harsher than he'd intended, more aggressive than professional. To anyone watching, it looked less like enforcement and more like bullying. What struck him most, however, was Elena's demeanor throughout the video. She never raised her voice, never argued, never lost her composure. Even when Mark handed her the ticket, she accepted it with quiet dignity. The contrast between them was glaring and damning. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. His superiors called him in for multiple meetings, probing every detail of the encounter. Did he feel threatened? Why hadn't he issued a warning instead of a ticket? Had he considered how his actions might be perceived? Each question chipped away at Mark's confidence, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Then came the tipping point. One afternoon, as Mark sat at his desk filling out paperwork, his sergeant approached him with a somber expression. "Gray," he said quietly, "you need to prepare yourself. This isn't going away anytime soon. Mark looked up, his throat dry. What do you mean? Elena Carter has decided to pursue disciplinary action, Hayes explained. She wants answers, not just for herself but for accountability across the board. And frankly, we can't afford another scandal. For the first time in his career, Mark felt truly powerless. The badge that had once symbolized authority now felt like a target on his back. He realized then that this wasn't just about him, it was about trust. Trust in the system, trust in law enforcement, trust in fairness. And whether he liked it or not, his actions, or missteps, had become part of a much larger conversation. That night, unable to sleep, Mark stared at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind. He thought about Elena's words again. You have no idea what you're dealing with. For so long, he'd believed his badge gave him power. Now he understood that true strength lay elsewhere, in humility, integrity, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. But was it too late for him to learn that lesson? The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, and Mark spent the days leading up to it in a fog of anxiety. He barely slept, tossing and turning as his mind replayed every possible scenario. Would Elena show up? What would she say? How could he defend himself without sounding defensive or worse, guilty? The uncertainty gnawed at him, leaving him irritable and distracted. On the day of the hearing, Mark arrived early, dressed in his uniform, hoping it might lend him some semblance of authority. But as he sat in the sterile conference room waiting for the proceedings to begin, he felt anything but powerful. The walls were bare except for a clock that ticked loudly, each second stretching out like an eternity. Across the table sat representatives from Internal Affairs, their faces impassive, notebooks ready. Beside them was Elena Carter, calm and composed as ever, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. When the meeting began, the atmosphere was tense. The investigators started by reviewing the facts, the speeding violation, the traffic stop, the dashcam footage. They played the video again, this time with everyone watching. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he heard his own voice, sharp, commanding, almost confrontational. It didn't sound like him, or at least not the version of himself he wanted others to see. Elena spoke next. Her tone was measured, her words precise. She recounted the events of the night, describing how she'd been driving home after a long day when Mark pulled her over. I wasn't arguing with the ticket, she said, her gaze steady, but I couldn't help noticing the way Officer Gray conducted himself. His demeanor suggested something more than enforcement. It felt personal. Mark's stomach churned. Personal? That wasn't his intention. Or was it? He thought back to the moment he saw her car speeding past him. Had he pulled her over because of the 5 miles per hour over the limit, or because he wanted to assert control? The line between duty and ego suddenly seemed dangerously blurred. When it was his turn to speak, Mark hesitated. He cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I followed protocol, he began, his voice quieter than he intended. She was speeding and I issued a citation. That's all there is to it. But even as he said the words, he knew they sounded hollow. Protocol wasn't just about following rules. It was about fairness, respect, and judgment. And judging by the looks on the faces around the table, no one believed he'd exercised those qualities that night. After hours of questioning and deliberation, the panel announced their decision. Mark wouldn't lose his job, but he would receive a suspension without pay and be required to undergo mandatory training on ethics, de-escalation, and community relations. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it stung nonetheless. For someone who prided himself on being above reproach, this felt like a public humiliation. As the meeting adjourned, Mark gathered his things, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Just as he reached the door, Elena's voice stopped him. "Officer Gray," she called softly. He turned reluctantly, bracing himself for another blow. But instead of anger or accusation, her expression was thoughtful. "I hope this experience gives you something to reflect on," she said. "It's not too late to change for yourself and for the people you serve." Her words lingered in the air, simple yet profound. Mark nodded stiffly, unsure of what to say. As he walked out of the building, the weight of her statement pressed down on him. Change. The word echoed in his mind, unfamiliar and daunting. Could he really do it? Or was he too set in his ways? For the first time in years, Mark questioned, not just his actions, but the beliefs that had shaped them. Was he truly serving justice, or was he merely wielding power? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The suspension gave Mark plenty of time to think, more than he wanted, in fact. For weeks he stayed home, avoiding the judgmental stares of neighbors and the awkward silences when old friends asked how work was going. At first, he tried to convince himself that Elena had overreacted, that she'd turned a minor traffic stop into something much bigger to further her own agenda. But the more he replayed the events in his mind, the harder it became to ignore the truth. He started spending hours sitting on his porch, staring at the quiet street where kids played and cars passed by slowly. He thought about all the times he'd pulled people over for minor infractions, broken taillights, rolling stops, speeding by a mile or two per hour. Had he always been fair? Or had he let his ego get in the way, using his badge as a tool to assert dominance rather than protect and serve? One afternoon, while flipping through channels on TV, he stumbled upon an interview featuring Elena Carter. She was talking about accountability in law enforcement, her tone calm but firm. "It's not about punishing officers," she said. "It's about creating a system where everyone feels safe, not just those wearing uniforms." Her words struck a nerve. Safe. That was supposed to be his job, wasn't it? To make people feel secure, not intimidated. Determined to understand her perspective better, Mark decided to reach out. It wasn't easy. Pride fought against humility every step of the way. Finally, after drafting several versions of an email, he sent a simple message. "Ms. Carter, I'd like to apologize for my actions during our encounter. If you're open to meeting, I'd appreciate the chance to discuss what happened." To his surprise, she responded within hours. "I'm willing to meet," she wrote, "but know this. Apologies aren't enough. What matters is what comes next." They agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, away from prying eyes. When Mark arrived, Elena was already seated at a corner table, sipping tea. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "Thank you for coming," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. Elena nodded. "Let's cut to the chase, Officer Gray. Why did you ask to meet me?" Mark took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize for how I handled things that night. I realize now that I came off as aggressive, and that wasn't my intention." She studied him for a moment, her dark eyes piercing. "Intentions don't erase impact," she replied. "You might not have meant to intimidate me, but that doesn't change how it felt. Do you understand the difference?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, I do. And I'm sorry. Truly." Elena leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "Apologies are a start, but they're meaningless without action. This isn't just about me, it's about how you treat everyone else moving forward. Every driver, every citizen, every person you interact with deserves respect. Your badge doesn't give you power, it gives you responsibility." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Responsibility. Not authority, not control. Responsibility. He realized then that he'd spent years seeing his role backward. The badge wasn't a weapon to wield, it was a promise to uphold. "I want to change," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if I can." "You can," Elena said firmly. "Start by listening, by questioning your instincts, by remembering that the people you pull over aren't obstacles, they're human beings. It won't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." For the rest of the conversation, they talked about accountability, reform, and the challenges facing law enforcement. Elena didn't sugarcoat anything, but neither did she dismiss him outright. She challenged him to reflect on his choices and consider their ripple effects. By the time they parted ways, Mark felt both humbled and hopeful. As he walked back to his car, he realized something important. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And while he couldn't undo the past, he could shape the future. One decision, one interaction, one moment of humility at a time. When Mark returned to work after his suspension, the atmosphere at the precinct was different. His colleagues greeted him with polite nods, but there was an unspoken distance between them. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others offered cautious words of encouragement. "Glad to have you back," one officer said, though his tone lacked conviction. Mark understood. They were wary of being associated with someone who had drawn negative attention to the department. He couldn't blame them. The first few days back were humbling. Assigned to routine patrols and administrative tasks, Mark felt like he was starting over. But instead of resenting the demotion, he embraced it. Each traffic stop became an opportunity to practice what Elena had taught him: patience, empathy, and accountability. Instead of rushing to assert authority, he took a moment to explain infractions calmly, offering warnings when appropriate. To his surprise, drivers responded differently. Some even thanked him for his understanding. Still, whispers followed him wherever he went. Local news outlets occasionally revisited the story, using phrases like controversial officer and accountability in action. Mark knew the label would stick for a while, but he refused to let it define him. Slowly, he began rebuilding trust, not just with the public, but with himself. One evening, as he sat in his patrol car waiting for his shift to end, he heard a familiar voice on the radio. Dispatch announced a call about a stranded motorist near the highway exit. When Mark arrived, he found Elena Carter standing beside her sedan, its hood up and steam rising from the engine. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither speaking. "Looks like I got lucky," she said finally, breaking the silence. "My usual knight in shining armor." Mark chuckled nervously. "I'll take a look," he said, grabbing a flashlight from his car. As he inspected the engine, they exchanged small talk about her latest case, about how his training sessions were going. It wasn't much, but it felt significant. They weren't adversaries anymore. They were two people navigating a complicated relationship. By the time roadside assistance arrived, Elena turned to him with a faint smile. "You're doing better," she said. "Keep it up." Her words stayed with him long after she drove away. Better didn't mean perfect. It meant progress. And progress, no matter how slow, was worth celebrating. In the months that followed, Mark continued to grow. He joined community outreach programs, attending town hall meetings, and listening to residents' concerns. At first, it was awkward. Some people still saw him as the officer who had crossed paths with Elena. But as he listened more than he spoke, shared stories rather than gave orders, something shifted. People began to see him not as a symbol of authority, but as a person, willing to learn. Elena kept tabs on him too, occasionally sending articles or updates about police reform efforts. Their interactions remained professional, but there was mutual respect now, a quiet acknowledgement that their encounter had changed both of them. Looking back, Mark realized the badge never gave him power. True strength came from humility, from recognizing mistakes and working to fix them. The journey wasn't easy and it wasn't over, but for the first time in years, he felt proud, not because he wore a uniform, but because he was learning to earn it. As for Elena, she continued her fight for justice, ensuring that stories like Mark's served as reminders. Change wasn't instant, but it was possible, one step, one lesson, one life at a time.